Hey everyone, it's LS, and this is the patch 6.13 tier list, and I know that I haven't done a tier list in a little while, and the primary reason for that was that I was not playing a lot, and when I'm not playing, I feel like my feeling for the game and my opinions on the champions as well as the meta is not as strong as it should be, and so I wanted to wait until I came back a while and began to play a lot so that I could really get a feel of all of the champions and seeing how they interact with each other and their difficulty relative to the meta and relative to other champions inside of the meta. So when you're looking at this tier list, the first thing I want to point out is this is not for competitive, and the basis for the champions that you'll be seeing inside of the tier lists will be in their classifications of S, A, and B. S being the highest tier possible, A being a relatively okay pick still relative to the meta and other champions that you can expect to see in there, as well as the average level of the player inside of that tier. And then the B tier is stuff that is still somewhat reasonable, but usually only as a very niche pick, and it's not going to be nearly as strong as the other champions if you devote the same amount of time to them. Now, obviously, there is going to be exceptions to every rule, and that doesn't mean that there aren't some people that are really good at some champions, and they might not even appear on the tier list. So getting into this, again, it is not for competitive, so nothing here is talking about Challenger Series. This is not talking about LCS, LPL, LCK. That's an entirely different monster. This is strictly speaking for solo queue. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that Diamond 2 50 LP and above shares a tier list with Masters. So anyways, some of the point outs is going to be that Vladimir and Swain, you will notice them at S tier at every single rank. That's primarily because of their low mechanical difficulty and just how strong they are versus lack of coordination and communication coming from solo queue players. Because of that, you'll see them in every single tier, in mid and top, working all the way up to Challenger. So that's basically going to be the hugest change since the last tier list is they are now skyrocketed up to the highest tiers. Some other stuff that has changed is Kayle. You'll notice that she has fallen off considerably, and that's mostly because of the itemization changes that have occurred in the most recent patches, as well as the other champions who have come into the meta at the higher tier, such as S tier and A tier, make it relatively difficult for Kayle to actually just power through everyone and be as effective as she once was in the past for lower MMRs. Other stuff that you might be looking at as you're, witnessing this tier list is some very weird picks that are just completely out of place, out of place in your eyes, such as why is Heimerdinger appearing so frequently? And Heimerdinger appears so frequently because, again, lack of communication and lack of knowing what to do. And when that's basically happening, Heimerdinger can really just annoy people. He can put people on tilt, and tilt is a very real emotion that can be taken advantage of inside of solo queue. And that's why you see Heimerdinger appearing so often once you start reaching the higher tiers. Although I do acknowledge that he does begin to drop off once the average knowledge of the player at that tier does continue to increase, and so that's why when you begin to look at Diamond, Master, Challenger tier, he falls off a little bit. Other champions that you might have been expecting to see at lower MMRs but are not there, such as Kindred, Elise, Rek'Sai, etc., they're not there because relative to other champions that are available and require so much less attention and practice and training in order to achieve a very similar or superior result relative to the players that you're playing against at that ELO, or ELO, because I know everyone hates that, it's going to be very different. So rather than have to worry about hitting your cocoons at 40 minutes or, making sure that your mechanics on Elise's animation cancels or worrying about if your Kindred micro is on point and you getting a good ultimate off, or did you even get the ultimate off, or, is your early game going well? Do you have enough stacks on Kindred? You don't even need to worry about any of that if you just simply pick up other champions that are going to produce, again, a very similar or superior result, especially at the early stages of the game, and they can really just bust open stuff. And as you begin to get better and, climb up the tiers, you move up the ladder, then you can start incorporating more difficult champions because they're going to have a lot more impact. And relative to the level of gameplay that you're experiencing, you're going to need that kind of impact in order to continue to win and continue to climb up the ladder. But at the lower stages, I am fully of the opinion, and I would defend it to the death, that champions like this are going going to be vastly superior to pick and play. But at the lower stages, what some people fail to realize is that making less mistakes than your opponent is almost always superior to anything else you can do. And what better way to do that than not having to worry about skill shots or having to worry about these very technical, mechanically demanding plays that are going to be asked of you if you're playing a lot more difficult champions in order to make them useful at the later stages of the game. Some other things that some people might be wondering is, why does Malzahar start appearing again at Platinum after he disappeared in Gold altogether? And that's primarily because Malzahar does have a little bit of a wonky laning phase with making sure that his E can CS the entire wave and making sure how to micromanage your voidlings during the laning phase. In the later stages of the game, his reliance on spacing and positioning in teamfights is relatively difficult, and also if you don't have your W up or if you can't cast your combos at correct times, it gets pretty difficult to make sure that you can manage him. He enters play into the higher levels because I fully do believe that at the higher levels, Malzahar is one of the strongest picks in the game right now in top, mid, and jungle. Another thing people might be curious about is, why is Tahm Kench so low on the tier list? This is primarily because with the potency that other top laners currently have in the meta, primarily Vladimir, Swain, and some other top laners, Tahm Kench has a pretty rough time in the top lane, especially when the new matchup versus the remake Shen is a little bit more difficult for Kench this time around than it was against the old Shen, and that can be definitely problematic for him. Another thing is, why is Swain being so high? Well, Swain is so high on the list because he's just something that in pro play, it's a lot easier to abuse him and make use of timing attacks against his vulnerabilities and weaknesses. In solo queue, that is something that tends to be almost completely absent. And so Swain is a complete monster in solo queue, again, primarily because of the lack of communication and because he's so safe and such a dominant lane bully in a lot of matchups. For AD carries, Lucian and Ashe being almost everywhere on this list as the god tier AD carries almost always in the S rank is basically because they are the cookie cutter AD carries and they don't really demand you to do anything flashy. The only reliance that Ashe has on a very important skill shot is her arrow, but let's be honest that it's not really too difficult to hit. When you're starting to worry about your Callista kiting, or can you land your W's on Jhin, or how do I set up some sort of a stealth mode attack with Twitch, it becomes a lot more problematic to win fights at the later stages. Another thing about Jhin not appearing before the highest tiers. This is primarily because Jhin is so reliant on positioning and other factors in order for him to be useful at the later stages of the game. His W is extremely difficult to hit, and it's really important how to make sure that you're using his passive to its fullest effect. And so that's why I don't include Jhin at almost any of the lower MMRs, because Lucian and Ashe are just so much better to play and will ultimately produce a much higher win percentage if you devote enough time to them. Moving over to another startling thing at the Master and Challenger tiers is, why is Aurelion Sol and Azir at such a low rating? Now you'll notice that they're both inside of the B tier, especially given that Azir is arguably the best mid laner in the game. Why is he so low on the solo queue tier list rating? This is primarily because outside of pro gamers and top amateurs, it's relatively rare to see someone perform extremely well on Azir to a point where you wouldn't fault them or blame them for losing the game because of a mechanical failure. Because of this, there's other champions that are available that are going to produce relatively similar results in terms of the early and mid-game stages on other champions and enable more impact than an Azir would grant if you're incapable of controlling him to his fullest extent. Because of this, Aurelion Sol and Azir are relatively low on the standings just because they're so hard to play and the room for mistakes are so high and they're so unforgiving at that level of play. Finally, rounding this all out, I know that this was talked about a lot in the last tier list, but why is Janna so low? Janna's as low as she is primarily because she can't actually carry a game by herself at the lower MMRs. Even at the higher MMRs, despite how good she is, especially in 6.13, there's other supports that will synergize better with AD carries and enable the support player a lot more control over the game. If you look at champions like Bard, or you look at a champion like Soraka, who is arguably the only hyper carry support that currently exists in League of Legends, Janna doesn't really stack up to them relative to one's ability to control and dictate the pace of the game. While Janna is extremely powerful, and even more so in competitive play, she's a little bit lackluster when you're left feeling like there's nothing you can do because of other problems that are going on inside of your team. Other support champions enable you to sometimes take control of the game and even end up coming out as a carry yourself, even in terms of damage output. Mostly I'm looking at Bard and Karma in that regard. So anyways, this basically makes up the patch 6.13 tier list. As you can see, all the champions are right here. If you want the full image, you can see that in the description below here on the YouTube video, or you can just go back to the original scene and possibly just press full screen and you'll see it there. Basically, for an entire rundown, if you do want to listen to that, I will probably be doing, again, just like the previous patch 6.13 tier list video, I will be doing a stream going over all of the champions and answering questions in Twitch chat within a few days from the release of this video. If you're curious what day that will be, the date and the time of that stream will be linked in the YouTube video description below, and you can check it out and you can join the stream then. And for people that can't catch that stream then, that'll probably be recorded on my twitch.tv page, and you can watch it there. So anyways, I hope you guys all enjoy this tier list, and I'll be answering questions in the YouTube comments below about anything, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye!